Hi everyone, welcome to this presentation today on intercultural collaboration. This webinar today is presented as part of OnQ's professional development program. My name is Landon Walliser. I'm the creative administrator for OnQ. And before we begin today, we just wanted to thank our funders for making this event possible. Specifically, our funders for OnQ professional development this year are the Canadian Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund, administered by Canadian Heritage. OnQ is an organization based in Regina on Treaty 4 land, which is the traditional territory of the Nehiyawak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And we are incredibly grateful to be working and providing space for artists here on this land. And we are committed to working with Indigenous artists and creating reconciliation for past harms and a better way forward together. Today, we also specifically want to acknowledge the people on Treaties 2, 6, 8, and 10 as well. Today, our presenter is going to be Deneh'Cho Thompson, who will be supported by two interpreters, Brandy Radcliffe, and Sue Schmid. Deneh'Cho is an assistant professor at the University of Saskatchewan and the coordinator of Wichita-Win Theatre Program, and he is going to talk about what it takes to work in the large and medium theaters across Canada. Deneh'Cho is a Dene director, actor, and playwright, and displaced and dispossessed member of the Pedziki Nation, an assistant professor in the Department of Drama at the University of Saskatchewan, as I said. And one of the few Indigenous, and the program that he heads up at the university is one of the few Indigenous theatre programs housed in a Canadian university. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Deneh'Cho.
Thank you, Landon, and good afternoon for those of you joining us. As was introduced, my name is Deneh'Cho Thompson. I'm a long-time theater artist and thinker, having landed in Saskatchewan just before the pandemic, and trying to develop a community practice here in the province that aligns with my national and international practices as both an artist and a scholar. I received my undergrad from Simon Fraser University and my master's from University of Alberta. So I continually move east. I think the University of Winnipeg is hiring right now. So I have a short-ish, sort of flexible presentation about my thinking around collaboration across sort of social contexts or positions. I rely in my own research a lot on my own experiences as an artist and as an Indigenous person. I also read a bunch of really, really smart, big thinkers that use big words. And so excuse me if I end up in some bizarre academic language. I will return to lay language very, very quickly. I'm joining you today from Saskatoon, not far away from Regina. We didn't get quite the storm you did, but it certainly snowed, and I don't want to go out today. Yeah, so other than that, I think I will do some presentation here. And then hopefully there will be enough exciting things to talk about to have a little discussion towards the end. If that goes for a while, great. If it doesn't go for a while, great. Also, anyone that's interested in continuing these kinds of conversations, feel free to email me at my university email. It's on the internet, very widely accessible. And please excuse me when it takes a month to get back to you, because sometimes that's the life of an academic. I've discovered in the last few years is we are overburdened in certain ways, mostly by our own doing, but that is life. Great. So I'm going to share screen here. Sharing. I would like to share my presentation. Great. And there we go. As far as I can tell, everyone is visible. My own little thing to the side. Great. So Collaboration across cultures is the title of my presentation here. That's me. We're doing a presentation today for OnQ Regina. Oh, hello. There we go. So I'll start by letting you know kind of like what I'm thinking about. And I think instead of like, this is what we're going to talk about, I prefer to do a little something more along the lines of like, this is what I'm thinking about. And then we can have an exchange of ideas later. And I will bring in some other people's thinking. So we'll probably start by sort of defining the terms about what we're talking about. This notion of cross-cultural or intercultural collaboration, I think is really broad and specific. And I think I can talk to what I think we're actually talking about, and then more specifically, what I'm actually talking about. I'll dive in a little bit to why we're talking about this. I think it's, I think we have a sense of it as an industry right now of why these kind of conversations are important. But again, I think defining our parameters and rationale and the realities we're working in is very important. And then I'll talk about principles of relationality. Relationality is what I couch the majority of my own work in, and how I conceive of collaboration, community building, and really just sort of ethical responsibilities of being in the world with other beings. And then I'll talk about some of the stuff I do as an artist and how that plays out, and as an educator. And more really honestly, things I've learned from practice and thinking in this area. Like I said, I really draw on my own experience, thinking about what has happened in different collaborations I've worked on. And then hopefully we'll have a wee little discussion. So what is intercultural? Merriam-Webster calls intercultural occurring between or involving two or more cultures. So if we start thinking about what culture is, there really isn't a clear understanding of what intercultural is, right? Because we can have nation-based cultural identity, we can have family cultures, we can have departmental cultures in universities across the world have some similarities, but then within a university we'll have cultural differences. I will be part of a community that maybe my sibling, for example, is not, and so we will have cultural differences there. So it's for me really important to think about, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about across culture? And in Canada right now, most of the time what we're actually talking about is across race, gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, gender itself. There's all sorts of just, poverty, wealth. We can talk about all of these things, but really when we're talking about intercultural in this context, we're talking about oppressed and non-oppressed. We're talking about white and other. We're talking about, like what Edward Said defined it as othering, others, and all of that kind of work, right? And I think that's really important to acknowledge. We're not, often there are non-white people collaborating together. It's really common, but I think really what we're trying to talk about in this context is white people and cis and straight, really the majority class collaborating with people outside their own sort of community or social circle or cultural circle. And then I found it really interesting, the noun, excuse me, of interculture is a common set of social norms, conventions, etc., adopted by a group whose members are culturally diverse. So the notion here is that we have differences and similarities, right? And so we can use that to start to think about what we each bring to the table, and what we share, and how those things might collide to make new exciting things, how we might, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but how we might use our differences and similarities strategically and intentionally to create good working relationships, art with meaning, sustained, ongoing relationships that aren't extractive or exploitational, as we're seeing a lot of conversation about in the theater world and beyond in the last maybe 7 years, 8 years. And that's just a stock photo of some people looking for answers. So talking about these sort of differences and similarities, I want to talk about Willie Ermine, who is an Indigenous scholar, pretty smart guy, wrote a really, really important paper called Ethical Spaces of Engagement. And the basic premise here, excuse me, is that ethical spaces of engagement, and I'll just read this quote and talk a bit further about it. It is formed when two societies with disparate worldviews are poised to engage each other. It is the thought about diverse societies and the space in between them that contributes to the development of a framework for dialogue between human communities. And so this is that difference, right? And so instead of trying to permanently mix and affix our two cultures or two groups or 2 points of view, we're actually looking to see where they meet and create a third space, right? So in collaboration, I don't think about us coming together. I think about us meeting and creating something new, right? And that's a really important thing because of the knowledge paradigms and the power of knowledge paradigms that we have seen historically. There's an Indigenous scholar, Aileen Morton Robinson, who talks about the white possessive, right? And this idea that whiteness and white knowledge institutions, universities, legal systems, etc., feel that they have the right to all knowledge, right? These systems don't think that they should be excluded from knowledge, and we see it all the time, right? But I won't get too far into that. So this notion that we work together to create a third space also requires an ethical way of working, right? As Armand is suggesting here. And so there's a lot of different ethical frameworks for relationality and how we come together. And there's one in particular that is very common in the prairies. It's the Deneh'Cho Cree concept called Wakotowin. And it is effectively practicing relations, dynamic, beyond human and human. We are all connected, relational practice, which then requires you to think about sort of ethical engagement with the world around you, right? So we are all in a relationship, whether or not that is good or bad relationship. That relationship's always there. And so how do we work in a principled way to do our best to be in good relationship with the world around us, as opposed to taking from the world around us, which is a framework that we're seeing a lot of resistance to in certain industries in our part of the world right now. So what have I got next? Relationality. We can talk more about relationality. Oh my. Sorry, I had COVID a couple of weeks ago and certain things escaped me. But this is from a very particular book that Joanne Archibald, there you go. Storywork. It's a research sort of methods book that I used in my MFA thesis for some thinking. And so around relationality, this is a diagram of one concept of that, of what Archibald calls Indigenous holism. And so this notion is that you are at the center of your experience of the world. It's not that you're at the center of the world, it's that you have a perspective. And in particular Indigenous worldviews, there is an effort to balance the self through the intellectual, the spiritual, the emotional, and physical. And then what Archibald is proposing, and has taken a lot of work with particular cultural people to propose this, is that from oneself, you then can do the balancing of that in concentric circles that go out. So family, community, nation. We can think of that in a professional context, right? Like self, colleagues that you work with, and then maybe peers in your industry, collaborators might fall somewhere in there, right? Like it's sort of an expansive notion of your responsibilities centering on the self. And I think this is a really great framework, because then you're thinking about the physical, emotional, spiritual, intellectual well-being of all of these circles that you interact with. And you have many different circles that you interact with too, right? Like I talked about the professional, there's also, your family has a different sort of a set of stuff. And then we look at, community, nation. What is nation? Is it, for me, is that my Indigenous nation? Is it the nation state of Canada? Is it the provincial sort of state? Is it Canadian nationalism? There's lots of these questions. And so you can continue to think, but you have a framework that you're looking at to understand how you might relate in a good way, as is often said. There's a couple of other ideas that I think are really exciting. Sure, yeah. In notions of relationality, there's a scholar, Dave Garneau, who talks about various spaces, but the one I like to use is in irreconcilable spaces of indigeneity, which is a bunch of big words. What it's saying essentially is that we need various spaces to be able to heal, reconcile, build healthier communities, whatever we want to talk about there. And an irreconcilable space of Aboriginality is an Indigenous exclusive space. And this is not in the interest of excluding, but in the interest of having conversations that we need to have amongst ourselves. And I think equally, non-Indigenous people need to have conversations about the same topics without us. And we need to come together and have conversations, right? So we have these, again, sort of in this ethical engagement framework, we have these ways of needing to have various conversations separate and together. And this is in some way a notion about creating safe space, right? As an Indigenous person, and I think many people have various relatable experiences here around various identity markers. As an Indigenous person, if I am in a room with only Indigenous colleagues, there's a huge part of the conversation that we don't have to explain to each other some fundamental experiences that we all relate to. There's no need to censor certain things, worrying about reactions from non-Indigenous people. There's a different type of humor that is allowed, that is more honest based on our own traumatic experiences. There's a whole gamut of stuff that becomes possible. And I think about this in theater spaces as well, right? So what are the differences in collaborating as an Indigenous person in a mostly white production and a white space versus a mostly Indigenous and diverse BIPOC queer space as an Indigenous person? And that's actually the foundation of the first phase of my MFA research. We're looking at a picture of Iron Peggy by Marie Clements. This is the premiere production, happened in Vancouver. There's me peeking out behind my friend Adele. We've got Race Calvert on our right and Taryn Kootenay on the left. So to talk about these collaborations, I was really curious about my own practice as an actor. That was my first way into notions of what is different in my practice in these different spaces? How do I indigenize my practice? What is indigenizing practice? And ultimately what I came to was more interest in pedagogy. How do we teach better for Indigenous students? Well, and students generally. I think there are some major failings in our training system, but we can talk about that maybe in another presentation. And so first I was a student at U of A, and I was part of a production of Sarah Rule's Dead Man's Cell Phone. It was a master's thesis director. It was almost exclusively white bodies in a really institutional white space, white playwright. And so I was in it. I did my acting thing. I did all the things I normally would do. Looking at myself, what did I do in that space? How did I feel in that space? How did the space work or not work for me? And one of the things I noticed that was really impactful to me was community didn't function in the same way it would in other productions for me. We were called only when needed. We really didn't have like a big get to know you phase. We didn't really, any of us know each other going in, so we didn't really have relationship building time. And that for me made it challenging in certain ways. And then I moved on to Iron Peggy. All of these people were collaborators. All of the people in this photo were collaborators of mine from the past. Sherry Yoon from Boca del Lupo, a Korean Canadian woman, directed. So we had a very strong, diverse space. There were Indigenous designers on it. It was a very different kind of space. And one of the markers for me of that community, you'll be unsurprised to find, was the way we treated food and eating together. In this production and many productions of a similar diversity of a strongly Indigenous room and other BIPOC folk, the snack tables are epic. They are so good. Everyone's in there. They're sharing their food. They're sharing food with each other. It's expected that you feed each other. There's always something, there's a sweet, there's a cultural food, there's a salty snack. There's always something, right? And then on lunch breaks, even though we were rehearsing in Vancouver, which I find is much easier to disperse at lunch break than it is here in Saskatchewan, in my own experience, we almost always ate together. We'd find ways and reasons to sit down and eat together. And so that was like the first indicator of something really different for me. We shared life. It is a job, but there's sort of a trust and a safety that didn't exist in Dead Man's Cell Phone. And I'm not saying that all white spaces and white productions are like that. I'm just really comparing these two and trying to identify some of the things I was doing and experiencing. And then really interesting thing happened, and I won't get too far into it, but in reflecting about these spaces, oh, okay, we can go back. That's fine. But I want to see that photo. There you go. In reflecting on this, I actually had a really huge transformative realization about the actual technique and practices that I employed. And I was able to reconceptualize some of the Western training that I had to better align with my own Indigenous worldview, because a lot of the time my experience in acting training contradicted my own personal value system or belief in my own existence, right? Like it was contradictory with who I am fundamentally. And so after all of that, I really started thinking about like, what are these spaces that are really great, And then I got this job here. I was pretty excited. I was like, wow, this is cool. I'm going to teach. I moved all my books into my office. And then February 2020 happened, and I moved all my books back home. And as many of you know, that was probably one of the most challenging years most of us have experienced on a personal emotional, social, and community level. The fracturing of community was really felt, I think, by everyone in a way that many people hadn't experienced prior to that. And so as we emerged from that and started doing productions again in the next year at the university, I started to think about what we had learned about taking the time to care for yourself during that first year, and how do we apply that to our overzealous show must go on industry. And so we started that, in the productions we were doing at the university. We're trying to not have and we're only barely starting to succeed even now, trying not to have students at school from 8 a.m. till 11 p.m. every day. How do we get them to rehearse in the afternoon and evening and go home, right? Instead of being there until nighttime. How do we build in an understanding that if you're sick or you have a family emergency or you have a doctor's appointment, that is an acceptable reason to go away from a rehearsal. And I'm doing that as much as I can professionally as well. And so I'll talk about a couple of examples of work I've done in the last few years that I felt has really embodied collaboration in a really human, interpersonal, relational way that ultimately is also what we might call cross or intercultural, although I've obviously problematized that, and so I'm not super comfortable with those terms, may be evident by now. On the left here, beautiful set design by Beth Cates and Moses Lumham for Cottagers and Indians. I directed this at the Blythe Festival this past summer. Moses is from Kettle and Stony Point First Nation. He's a painter by trade. He's not a set designer. And all of that work you see upstage and down around the apron of the stage, that's all Moses's work. And he's a wonderful collaborator. Beth Cates, really big, renowned designer. If you don't know Beth, you should look Beth up. Beth does incredible stuff in digital spaces, in physical spaces. Really loves to blow up our understanding of design possibilities. And this is exactly what her rendering looked like after our collaboration, which is wild to me. Like, I never see the rendering come up like the stage. So that was really cool. Kudos to the whole team that built it. And so Beth was unable to join us in Blythe, actually. And we all came onto the project late for various reasons. So Beth, Moses, and I had our collaborative design happen with the artistic director and all of the builders in the company in the first week of rehearsal, effectively, and we did it all online. And it was really quite collaborative. We had a lot of time sitting and discussing the principles of how this set worked, the play, what we were trying to demonstrate. Cottagers and Indians, for those of you that don't know it, is a two-person play, relatively static. Most of the designs permanently split the characters off from each other, so they really don't interact in each other's space. There's 10 pages off the top of the play where one of the characters is meant to be sitting in a canoe, and there's an unavoidable joke about it 10 pages in, which Drew Hayden-Taylor gives us a huge problem there, right? Like, seeing an actor for the first 10 pages not move is not terribly exciting. So we had all of these sort of understandings of these challenges, and we worked incredibly collaboratively to sort of put this idea on stage. And we did it all over Zoom, which is really incredible. And I could talk about that in another presentation, but we all came to this from different practices with different understandings. Beth is a Jewish woman. Moses is local to that area of Ontario. And obviously I'm Deneh from the Northwest Territories, working in Western Canada. And so all of this discussion we had about our understandings of the play, and they were long discussions. This is not a typical designer-director relationship. It was a lot of work together, and it was really fantastic. But in all my career, I have never had a better understanding of what I needed to do as a director in the room than in this production, because we spent the time listening and talking and dreaming and breaking and unbreaking this design, and we worked it. And so after that first few days of doing that, we got into rehearsal, and I knew what the show was in a way I never had. And that's because I had a really, really close collaboration on an Indigenous show with a non-Indigenous designer and an Indigenous designer who's not a designer. And so these really diverse perspectives, really intercultural in a number of different ways, if you think about it, right? Like we've got different practices from different places, racially different identifiers. Moses is a dark-skinned Indigenous man. I'm a light-skinned Indigenous man. Like there's a whole gamut of differences there. But relating in a good way with good intentions allowed us to create this really beautiful show. And then when we were working in the room with the actors, we had a clear idea of what was going on, which allowed us to treat each other like humans more. And so I'm really rallying against the show must go on model. It's a two-person play. It was 40 degrees in Ontario at that time. And we were rehearsing in a not so well air-conditioned room. So we would rehearse until we were done, and that was fine. If we rehearsed 10 to 3 that day, that's what we did, and the company supported it, and it allowed for Kelly McIntosh, who was playing one of the characters, who lived a town over, to go and do the family things that she needed to do regularly. It allowed for when something came up that was a problem that needed to be addressed at sort of a more production level that we couldn't move forward without, we went, okay, we'll take a break. Or if everyone was feeling exhausted, we'd start a little later so that people would be able to be there. And this treating each other in this way, I think actually elevated our collaboration. So I feel like the product itself, although we took a similar amount of time, we worked in a similar style, but we just slowed it down and took care of ourselves. I think the product was comparable to a sort of whip and carrot kind of, like a thing of trying to push through, because I think we were able to do really quality work and let it settle and let it integrate, which is something we don't do in our 2-week, 6-day, 10-on-12 into production model. So on the right, 25th Street Theatre did their first production that wasn't the Fringe in a couple decades, I think, actually. Last year and a half ago, at Persephone Theatre. It's a play called Fruitcake, written by Heather Morrison and dramaturged by Lenore Harem, who is in this photo. It's a Christmas play about a family sort of misunderstanding and frustrations and things like that. That also deals with trans identity. And while Heather is not a trans playwright, there was a lot of work around how do we make this a play that is presentable? How do we feel comfortable presenting it? Are there conversations that need to happen before, after, during? And it's the same with a lot of non-dominant social groups or identity groups. Indigenous theater for a long time, like what's the first big famous play? Ecstasy of Rita Joe. George Riga is not Indigenous, right? And so this is the beginning, I think, of a bigger movement on main stages in Saskatchewan and across the country. But the thing I want to talk about here is Bruce Sinclair, who's featured there with a really creepy, realistic baby prop. It's like freaky how real that thing looks. I don't like it. Bruce played my father. and I played a dad character to a trans teenager. And Bruce and I are both Indigenous, but the characters are not written as Indigenous, which, first of all, what a gift. We get to just play a character. We don't have to mine ourselves. We don't have to extract these things from our own identities to be able to feel like we know what we're doing. No, we're just playing people. We're just playing people. We're not Indigenous people. We're not non-Indigenous people. We're people. And so at some point in the production, there were a series of media calls and interviewers with various at various points in their learning about how to use appropriate terminology, how to just generally not be super offensive, even incidentally, to trans people. And there was also a moment where we really questioned the messaging of the play. And we stopped rehearsal. We stopped and we had a very, very long discussion about, are we even going to go forward? And, bless Anina, who was producing and performing in the show. But Anina was ready and willing to cancel the show if that's what we needed to do, if we were doing something harmful. And so that, again, is this like treating each other as human and treating our audience as human and treating them with care and respect and trying to create good relationships with them is, in my experience, not the typical process that we go through. So that was very liberating. And then, as some of these more challenging conversations were happening, they weren't about my own identity, right? So I wasn't invested them in the same way as the trans people in the room, including the director and multiple performers. But I did realize that as an Indigenous performer, I had experiences that were comparable in my own career. And so what I was able to do was be empathetic to that, but also take the opportunity to say, if you need me to take the hit on any of that, I'm willing. And this is not to champion myself, but to say that because my identity would not be attacked in the more challenging moments, I would be safer than my peers. And I understood that. And I was able to, as a collaborator, say, hey, something that might hurt you, I might be able to just step in front of, right? If it's an audience member in a talkback, if it's an interview, or if it's any of these things, I understand the type of weaponizing that can happen here in a way that means that I can maybe be of help. And again, I'm not trying to champion myself as a hero or anything here. These are all wonderful performers who have wonderful capacity to be able to deal with difficult situations. But it did illuminate for me the importance of collaborating with collaborators that might have had similar experiences of oppression or othering. And so we're talking about intercultural theater. In this case, one of the exchanges was the trans community and the Indigenous community. There's also, like Bruce and I were the only ones that were not white in the group. So there is a whiteness and Indigenous identity collaboration there as well. And we were at Persephone, which is, as all of our big regionals are, predominantly white spaces, predominantly unwelcoming to the queer and or trans community in certain ways, right? Like gendered bathrooms and things like that. But I found it really interesting to be able to reflect and go, okay, this is something tangible that I now understand what the importance of collaboration is. And so I want to go all the way back to my MFA thesis before starting to wrap up here. So I used to be really into high art, right? I wanted to make the thing as good as we can. I want to be really technique heavy. I like really intense practitioner. I trained all the time. I was doing classes. I was eating probably 3,500 calories just because I was working so much. You know, I was in the studio all the time. I was very physical. And I loved all of that. I'm not throwing that out the window. But I've started to think about what the success of theater is for me now. And it aligns with my teaching practices as well. And I'm trying to bring in sort of better relational practices there. But I see now my work, if I want to put it all under one umbrella, my professional practice, my artistic practice, my writing practice, my scholarly practice, my teaching practice, all of those things, I think it's all about community building now. So I'm less interested in what a beautiful design that show is, right? Like I'm not upset about that. But my objective is not that beautiful design. That is not the thing I'm interested in anymore. Many years ago, I was teaching some English literacy students at the Squamish Nation in North Vancouver. And I was brought in as a facilitator and facilitated the performance of one of their stories, Raven and the Blackberries, for their entire community. It happened at Presentation House Theater. It was really lovely. And something happened there. I mean, the majority of the students were 55 plus, struggling with English literacy, had experienced a number of systemic traumas, abuse, violence, separation from family. And so we're typically quiet, reserved, not necessarily elevated as heroic in their community, right? And so we did this one production, and everyone, like 9 months old to elder shuffling in with a walker, the whole community was there. And the thing I saw that day was not about the performance on stage. Everyone in that room was incredibly moved by the capacity of these late in life women, mostly, who had experienced a bunch of trauma, to get up publicly and embrace culture and story in front of the community. And it inspired others to do that kind of work. And youth got to see that. And elders who were both connected and trying to reconnect were inspired by that. And I could literally see connections happening between people in the room in a way I've never seen or been able to see maybe until that point in my career. And so it's brought me to this notion of what I'm calling spiderweb aesthetics, based on some of my own cultural understandings. But essentially, the aesthetic I'm interested in is how do we build healthier communities? Jill Carter teaches at U of T, really fantastic scholar. In one of her articles suggests that we need to build communities worth caring for. Because if those communities are worth caring for, they will perpetuate. We will continue to build that community and keep that community healthy. And so if we come together as a society understanding that our work is community building and to build communities worth caring for, that is maybe the better objective than hitting every perfect note in a Sondheim musical. Not to say that's not an exceptional skill, and not to say that is any less desirable, but I don't know that that is the objective I'm after anymore. I think we should still be able to do those things. I'm not saying let's not do that, but I think that's not my priority in the same way. What do I got next? Oh yeah, look at that. I could talk for much longer, but I think I've talked for quite some time. So I want to thank everyone for listening to me, and hopefully we can have a few minutes of discussion before we wrap things up.
Deneh, thank you so much for that talk. It was just terrific from my standpoint. It raises so many questions for me. I guess one is a practical question that comes with the territory. that On Cue has set out for itself, and consequently the artists that have kind of gathered around us. So we have specifically carved out our focus on people who have been historically underserved in the theater community, both the communities that would be the audience and the artists on the stage. And with that territory comes a bringing together of people from all of those different spaces, and Indigenous, newcomers, people of color, people from the disability and deaf communities, and obviously people from the queer community. These are very different groups of people. I mean, they have their own communities, and as you pointed out, they have overlaps as well. And so there's intersectionality going on there. But it's, you know, the impulse when you bring that diversity of our communities today together is to want to work together, to come together in a good way. The challenge is often, how do so you have an idea. If you're an artist, you have an idea and you happen to align with one of those particular communities. So you have an idea. You don't want to work necessarily with the same old people that are the comfortable folks that are part of your community, so to speak. You want to draw others in to make the concept, the conversation more complicated, you know, more challenging, I guess. How do you go about this? And I'll put it in a practical practical question. So I want, we've had a couple of events where we've brought together, say our first event, focusing on cross-cultural work, involved Indigenous artists and newcomer artists, where we had a welcoming ceremony for the newcomer artists, and then discussed ways in which newcomers could work with Indigenous artists around truth and reconciliation. So suppose you're one of the non-Indigenous artists in that group, and you'd like to explore this further in a play, in a project. What is a good way to go about approaching someone who you have not worked with before? How do you create that relationship? Or how do you start that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think you've nailed it right there, right? It's like ongoing, meaningful, and ethical relationships, I think are the basis of the work we need to be doing, right? Because so often our artistic relationships are extractive and finite, right? We take a story and we take it away and we go do it elsewhere, and then the production's over. And may or may not talk to that person ever again, right? So building relationships, I think, is the precursor, right? And so there's this funny conversation I always have with myself around preferential treatment of people that are collaborators of mine already, and working relationally, right? And so there are collaborators that I think, well, like, obviously I have to work with you because we have an ongoing healthy relationship. That said, I don't think I should work exclusively with those people forever, because I'm going to become a bore very quickly. And I don't think our industry, and I don't think academia accounts for this, but like, how do we build those relationships before we ever get into the room? I think there's tons and tons of work around, you know, getting to know people, getting to know what they want. Letting them drive, like we talk about this in sort of certain research circles, of the people that you're trying to serve should be driving the research questions, should be driving the project questions. And again, our funding models don't necessarily account for that very well. But I think that is the essential thing, is how do we make it possible for people to do the kind of work they want to do instead of us presupposing what they want to do, because who are we to say that they want to do something or not? The other thing I think about a lot, and I thought about this previously in really an institute, like an academic institutional setting, but I now think about it more in our industry, is all this stuff about EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I have a big problem with inclusion, because inclusion is supposed that I am going to include you into my system. But if my system is harmful to you, am I doing you a disservice by including you in my system? So then we're actually looking at the need for systemic change as opposed to inclusion in this system, right? And it's a really like challenging concept, because how do we determine what is going to be better serving people that we want to be included in our system, or is our system maybe not a system they need to be included in, and we need to look at different systems and start new systems altogether? And so I'm not saying that to say like don't approach people. I'm saying it to think about like, how do we approach people in different ways that might be safer, healthier, and more supportive based on individual needs. When I worked at the Talking Stick Festival many years ago, I worked with Margot Kane, and it's big festival, national, international artists. It was really wonderful. But I always wondered, like, Margot's a really, really good host. Everyone that comes felt really hosted. Most of the people, not everyone, but like, and I thought, you know, like, how does she do that? How does she do that? And at one point, I don't know if she's conscious of this, but I realized she's not just hosting from her position. She's also hosting them the way they need to be hosted. And that's a really, really big difference. You know, like there's a way I host a dinner party, but if someone has a dietary need or has a toddler or anything, you know, like I change the time or I don't cook a certain thing. And I think we can start to think about that framework in how we work in spaces and how we include people.
Your comments, I actually haven't heard this discussion in Canada, but in the context of a discussion in Britain amongst the practical arts community, there was this, it was that inclusion discussion that was the focus of the event. How can we be more inclusive? And one lady who was a newcomer spoke up quite vigorously and said, you know, I don't want to be included in what you're doing. I want the money and the, I forget what she said, the money and the power to have our own organization where we do what we want to do, what we envision creatively. And so she really wasn't that excited about the inclusion discussion at all. And I've found it, in Canada, I haven't heard someone express that quite as vigorously. That often the discussion is more about the existing institutions need to be more inclusive. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me like perhaps it may be the time to have that other discussion. But yeah, I if somebody else here has a question, you've just generated so many questions with me. I don't want to dominate this conversation. Brad has joined us.
Brad, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I wasn't sure I was going to make it, but here I am through the snow and rain and everything else. Yeah, so I'm going to come at this from a pure white boy perspective. I thought I had this, well, I think I have this idea of doing some kind of play with an Indigenous woman who has been murdered, and a gay or transgendered person who's also murdered, and they meet in this liminal space, and they talk about their experiences and their prejudices and I don't know what. They come to some conclusion at the end of it. And so, but I don't want to write the part that comes from the Indigenous woman, because I'm not an Indigenous woman, but I would love to collaborate with somebody who is. And I don't have a connection to that community. Just don't. And I don't know how to break in.
So is your question about the collaboration or about finding collaborators?
Because it's just about everything. It is about making the connection with the community, with that theater community, the female end of things, and also the collaboration part. Like, I'm pretty open to however that happens. If my writing partner wants to collaborate in I just sit down and write kind of way, or if they want to put it together on its feet, just talk and record and do things like that, I'm happy to do it. That's what I'd like to do.
Yeah, so I mean, really complex, right? Because to my mind, you have to find something that really, really wants to talk about that subject, or find someone that you have a really, really strong, trusting relationship with, right? Because that kind of work is not going to enact the same sort of violence on you as it is that collaborator, right? Not to say that it won't be tough for everyone, but I mean, like, Indigenous women literally are at threat of dying at a higher rate than everyone. So it's going to, and people, Indigenous women that are probably a little more experienced in life are probably know someone that's not here anymore, right? So yeah, I mean, super delicate, and like finding someone that you have a long trusting relationship with, or someone who's doing that work that would be interested in doing it. If it were not this subject matter, for example, and this is actually probably still appropriate, but I just want to kind of take that off the table for the conversation for a moment. Go to stuff, talk to people, meet people. That's really it, right? Like, that's how all your collaborations after school probably happened, right? You were just like, hey, cool, like, you're neat, right? And you went for a pub night or a coffee or whatever, and suddenly you're running some company that you didn't think you'd ever want to run.
That's an interesting reference to a current experience, but anyway.
Yeah, well, I think for any of us that have been in leadership positions, you're like, man, that one beer really changed my life. It was the same at conferences or all of our gatherings, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just rambling.
No, I'm just, that's kind of the answer I expected. I wasn't really expecting anything earth-shatteringly different that would change my life. But I mean, I guess it's one of those projects, it's in my mind, it's at the back of my head. It kind of stays on the back burner until I actually meet that person, who would be interested in collaborating in that way.
Yeah, I mean, there's another possibility that I don't know how to do dramaturgically, but pretty sure it was Don Kugler when I was a student, might be someone else, but suggested that writing from ignorance is acceptable as well. So instead of writing with authority, write with ignorance. And I think that's a really interesting concept when you're writing about questions you have about communities that are not your own, right? Going, like, what don't I know, and how does that affect my perception of this? Mm-hmm. And it might turn into a whole bunch of stuff you got to scrap later, but I think it's an interesting possibility, right?
Yeah, and I think that that's kind of the way I'm going about it, is like, for the Indigenous woman, what does she know about gay men? What does she know about trans men? what does the trans person or the gay person know about the life of an Indigenous woman?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and again, like, dramaturgically, I don't know how to do that successfully, unless you have all the parties present, you know. But you know, I like big conceptual things, and I'm actually really lucky. I have a commission right now with Boca del Lupo. They're doing a project of commissioning a bunch of artists to not censor what they're working on for a period of time, and so don't censor it for yourself or for the audience or for the funder. You know, or the imagined reader, and just write all the things that you want to write about it. And I'm going to be doing that in May, and I'm really terrified. But it's a really exciting question, right? Of like, what do we censor? Why do we censor it? And you know, some of it I'll be like, whew, can't let anyone ever see that. And some of it might actually turn out to be provocative in a productive way, right? And so sort of freeing ourselves of that notion. And I think as writers, I'm sure anyone who writes knows this, is there's tons of stuff you put on the page that you know is absolutely wrong. But you have every intention of getting rid of that before it goes to a reading or to production.
I guess the writing, or you know, just the creative process in general, obviously there are lots of different motives for doing creative work. But one historically has been to learn, to understand, to empathize better, to search for truths that are not apparent on the surface. And so I guess Didi Kugler's advice to you with respect to writing out of ignorance, it certainly speaks to historic practices. But we also know that those historic practices have presented significant problems brought forward to us. And so navigating that is, I think, much more of a minefield these days.
As it should be, right? Like we should be learning to be more nimble, right? We've been too comfortable with harm for too long.
The concept of community, it cuts both ways. So community has been used, the definition of community is those who are inside the circle. However you're defining the circle, however you're drawing that circle. So there are people within a community, and people who are excluded from that community. And so often when people talk about community building, they're using but in with the, and I just want to observe that theater works in a historically it has worked in a way where people establish their company, their artistic community that they're working within, and they sort of circle the wagons. They get funding to do their work. But one of the reasons why On Cue exists is the challenge for artists who are new to the scene, who are been excluded for whatever reason, of finding their way into a company, a community, a space of artistic practice that accepts them in and what they have to offer. And you know, whether we're talking about cross-cultural connections, or whether we're simply talking about emerging artists finding a way into the space of theater, it is a very similar situation. How do you get in when you're outside?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation. And for me is actually why I typically use community building as the term instead of community, right? Because community, like you say, is to some degree finite, but the possibility of building is a creative act, right? So there's a possibility of expansion, there's a possibility of inclusion, there's a possibility of newness, right? I think there's something interesting though that isn't being practiced as much as it could be, are models like intergenerational models, where we always have everyone from like high school and interested all the way up to like, I can't remember my lines anymore, but I love theater, right? And I think every room should have that. And we try, like a lot of the projects I work on, we try and do that in Indigenous spaces because it's essential, right? And many artists kind of take that responsibility on as their own, right? We bring up people, you know, like you work on a show with someone who's fresh out of school and you go, don't stand there. And you like kind of like help them out and stuff like that, right? Like we do that stuff. But to build a structure for that as a company, to build a structure that is inclusive of, you know, the prox, those concentric circles, right? Like, how are we being responsible to bigger and bigger concentric circles from our position? Another thing I think about a lot with this relationality stuff that I'm thinking about is relationality is a responsibility. It's not anything else other than that. You are responsible to others, and your actions and choices and ways of being in the world and your ethical principles and your values, they impact the world around you. And so your responsibility is to try to reduce the harm you're doing in the world at all times, right? And so if you have this relational responsibility, you're not out for yourself. You're not looking at individual rights a lot of the time. You're looking at collective rights. Like, we as a collective have the right to exist in a better, healthier way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I don't know whether I could have this conversation with you. Wish you were closer. I'd like to take you out for coffee and have
Well, I mean, I'm surprised I'm doing this well. My COVID brain only went away 2 days ago, so.
Well, that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I just for me, the question I asked you earlier is how do we make it possible for people to start relationships with folks who are outside their circle? And for me, it's a huge challenge that I think that OnQ is facing, is how do we work? We're trying to support artists both in presenting their work, but also support them in terms of making connections, making relationships, developing that sense of community. When OnQ started with some all community forums, just general public invited to come and discuss the state of, at that time, theater. We hadn't migrated to all of the performing arts, as eventually we did. One of the first concerns that people expressed was that there wasn't a theater community in Regina. There were little corners of the community, but there was no sense of community. And so OnQ ultimately stands or falls on the basis of its capacity. It developed out of a desire to create a stronger sense of community, and it involved other performing arts disciplines sensing that community needed to be broader than just theater, but it needed to include a range of artists in the performing arts. But ultimately, OnQ stands or falls in its practical capacity to create that sense of community. Mm-hmm. And any kind of practical suggestions that you have from that standpoint would be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I think listening to you and I think you probably agree is the most successful community building is probably gathering, right? The times that you've had gathering has probably been where you've seen people make real connections, right?
Yeah.
And that's because, and like, so I sit on an advisory that I will not name right now, but we have 1 hour meetings once a month for a large notable company, and we're supposed to advise them on all things in this hour once a month. We don't even get through the agenda, and we're a bunch of Indigenous people that love to just visit. And so, like, informal gathering, I think, is just as important as any formal gathering, right? I think that's, we talk about this in the context of conferences. I think about it in school, like when students lost hallway chat during COVID, I think they lost a lot of learning opportunities. And so, I tried to intervene by making them have a group chat that I wasn't allowed to be in and stuff like that. And I think it had limited success. But I think the stuff that happens around events is actually the networking, right? Like you go for a drink at a conference, or you go for dinner with a bunch of people that you only kind of know that you've been working on a thing or whatever, right? And I've been wondering, because I was just in the herd, and unfortunately my COVID was part of why we got canceled, but another actor gave it to me, for the record. Wasn't just me. But I was joking. I was like, man, it'd be really cool if we could do like a bison feast for the community leading up to one of the performances or something. And I was only half being facetious, and I wonder about these things, is like, can we have a community feast before the Saturday evening show? And can we invite community and have it, the company in question offer a huge number of cheap tickets and have the funder pay for the food, and like just have this really big social event before and or after a show. And like you can open it to broader communities, or you can say people interested in theater generally. You can hire an Indigenous caterer, you can hire a South Asian caterer. Like you can really just, like, depending on what the context of it is go like, here, like, come theater, be with your people, be with people you relate to, that might not be the people you see on stage for Christmas Carol this fall.
I think one of the things that we're dealing with too is fear. So Mary, you talked about, community is really for those people who are on the inside of the circle. What about those people who are on the outside of the circle? But you have fear on both sides, right? And it's trying to dispel or get rid of that fear. And I mean, I think that community events is certainly one of the ways to do it. You keep offering community events, you keep inviting, you keep trying to bring people in, but you've got to really work on that fear from either side. What's it like on the inside? What's it like on the outside? And how do you, deal with that fear and get people to bring them together?
And I think that work falls on the people that have power, right? Like that work is about the people who have the power, the people in the circle. And unfortunately, we live in a society that bases a lot of our decision making on potentially being liable for stuff. But I think people in power would be served by radical transparency and honesty, right? Like, here's how we made all these decisions, and some of them are just shitty budget decisions, right? Like, this is the clear version of what we had to do. And we all screw up. It's how you respond to that mistake that is important, right? And I see a lot of companies, instead of, and not to name any companies, but instead of going, yeah, we messed up, here's what we're doing, please come let us know, or don't, or whatever. I see a lot of companies go like, here is our lawyer's definition of our apology that isn't quite an apology, right? And like, that's not good enough. It's not good enough, but of course everyone's scared they're going to get sued or canceled, as they call it, which is actually, I think, really a far right white concept now that is being used to attack liberal thought, as opposed to really anything of value. But that aside, like, I really think it is about that ability to own one's learning and to make it learning, and to be more transparent about how we do our stuff. it's all a big secret up in the castle. Like, if I didn't know how a company ran until I was running a company, like,
Wow.
as a 15-year-old theater kid, I had no idea how that stuff happens.
Well, one thing that you mentioned, food, is it's a big issue for us. I mean, we've experimented this winter by connecting food with some of the things that we're doing. And we did one event towards the end of January or beginning of February, where we combined an evening of performance with a restaurant meal in the same space. It was at the Science Center, which has a restaurant and a performance area. And that event sold out within less than 24 hours. The concept of involving food with any of these sorts of things, the public is ready for it. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges for social events is that many funders do not allow food as an allowable expense line item. Mm-hmm. And I wish people, I know that from an Indigenous community perspective, food is really important. I learned that as a researcher first, that if I was going to be working with Indigenous communities, food needed to be a significant part of the process.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And interestingly, that was an argument that could be made to a research agency, mm-hmm. not so much in the theater funding and arts agencies. I really wish Indigenous communities would lead the way in making that argument, because it's also true in newcomer and other types of culture. It's not just the Indigenous community.
It's funny. It's actually like the North American nuclear family residue that is the only place that isn't really a thing, right? Right? Like, that's really the only place. Putting on my little producer hat, I think there are ways to skirt that ever so slightly. For example, I mean, like, you could put it in your cultural outreach budget if it's an Indigenous show, right? It's cheeky and you'll only get away with it a few times, but you can do it. The other one is, like, if you're partnering with a company or something, and the food won't be covered, if you can get a grant to cover ticket price, a reduction in ticket price, and then get them covered to a point where they're paid, and people are paying $10, but that goes to the food budget, you've kind of like allocated, you've allocated ticket income and revenue instead of grant money, right? And it's technically, you haven't used the money for the food, right?
Right, absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that insight. Maybe we want to edit this particular discussion out. I'm not sure.
I mean, I have no major need from Canada Council at the moment, so I'm not too concerned about what I said.
Okay, good. All right.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, I mean, food, right? Like, and like sharing food in an informal way, and laughing and visiting and meeting people, and that's it.
Yeah, I'm married to a Chinese.
Many cultures, whether it's Indian or from the Muslim world, food is very important to getting things done. Even to the United Church, it's really important to have a potluck.
Well, yeah, even in this sort of like post-nuclear family world, you go to a small town church funeral or wedding, there's so much food that the community has made, right? And there's a bizarre nostalgia for weird white bread, cucumber, cheese sandwiches and stuff like that that I associate with both grief and celebration. But it still exists, and it's kind of funny that it isn't understood actively as a part of culture, right? Like, it's there, but why isn't it like? Well, and maybe it's part of our understanding of the arts and community in North America is those are add-ons to our value of life, right? We don't treat art and community as essential to our value in life.
I think you're right.